We're going to conclude this section with tahsin as-sawt, which is to beautify the voice when reciting. And of course, as mentioned by Imam ibn Qudamah rahimahullah, he says it's preferred that you beautify your voice. And if you do not already have a beautiful voice, then you do your best to beautify it. As for reciting the Quran bil-alhan, which are various melodies, then this is something disliked by the Salaf. So the melodies here don't mean necessarily maqamat, where you have like this kind of a rhythmic, melodious kind of pattern of recitation. But what it means is when you sacrifice the rules of tajweed for the sake of the melody, or for the sake of a sound you're trying to produce. So Imam Ahmad rahimahullah ta'ala was asked about reciting the Quran bil-alhan, right, with these melodies. He was asked about it, and so the Imam, he asked the one who was asking him, he said, "What's your name?" And so the man, he says, "My name is Muhammad." And he said to him, "Would you like to be called Ya Muhammad?" Right, so Mamdud, he says bil mamdud, right, to elongate. See, what's happened is you've for the sake of some type of sound or melody, what some reciters will do is they will elongate or change the rules of recitation for some, for some purpose of tone. Ya Muhammad, or for example the adhan, Allahu Akbar, they change the meaning of Allahu Akbar to mean Allah is the greatest, and when they elongate the first vowel sound, it means is Allah the greatest. So if they're looking for a melody, they have to be sure that it does not harm the meaning or break the fundamental rules of recitation. It's preferred that when you recite, it's done quietly. The preference is for you to recite quietly. There's a hadith that was reported that the virtue of reciting quietly over the virtue of reciting loudly is like giving charity in secret versus giving charity in public. Okay? So when you're reciting softly or quietly, you recite just enough to where you can hear your own self. There is no problem, however, reciting loudly in certain circumstances if there's a valid intention or a pure intention behind it. Like, for example, to improve one's memorization. The tajweed al-hifz. So sometimes reciting softly may not be the way that you memorize. You may need to recite loudly to memorize or strengthen your memory, or to kind of drive away laziness, lethargy, and sleep. So maybe sitting to recite quietly, you start to nod off and fall asleep, but if you raise your voice, then it will keep you going. Or to wake up someone who's not in a deep sleep. This may be a way to alert them to prayer, or to alert them to get up. You can recite in a loud voice in order to do that. As for the rulings of recitation during the prayer, the amount that's recited in the obligatory prayers and the times in which you recite loudly or quietly, all of those things are very well known and documented in the works of Islamic jurisprudence. And we've discussed this in some detail in the past when we're going over these rulings. I did mention this yesterday on the side about being able to hold the mushaf in order to recite the amount which is recommended during certain prayers. So the amount that is preferred is that Salat al-Dhuhr wal-Asr and Salat al-Isha are all you read certain portions in those prayers. So those three, Dhuhr, Asr, and Isha, you read an entire surah in each of the first two rakahs after al-Fatiha, and you select what you're going to read from Surah An-Naba to Al-Layl, what's including in between them, and this is for Dhuhr, Asr, and Isha. And that then you recite from for Salat al-Maghrib, you recite from Al-Duha to An-Nas, which are the shorter surahs. And then for Salat al-Fajr, you read from Qaf to the beginning of Juz Amma, or just before Naba. So In the instance that a person has not memorized or their memory is not strong, then it's permitted for them to hold the mushaf, even in the obligatory prayers. This is due to a need. It's not a common practice, obviously, and it's not something that should be perpetuated. However, if the need arises and a person, for example, a new Muslim, for example, is another great example. Somebody that's new to Islam and they need to read al-Fatiha. They can read it if you write it down for them, but they can't remember it yet. So they can have with them some little thing to hold and they can read al-Fatiha from a paper or from the Mus'haf, as well as someone that is more advanced in their Islam but is yet to reach the stage where they've memorized significant portions to lead prayer. Then they're permitted to hold something in order to do so, and it will not invalidate the prayer.
Is it also for the reason you mentioned that for Fajr prayer you have to have from Qaf to, or no, like can you use the same reason for that? Like you have to read from, if somebody didn't memorize Surah from Qaf to Surah An-Naba, then you can use the Musaf for the Fajr.
Well, the idea is that the Fajr prayer is a certain amount.
Mm-hmm.
Fajr prayer is typically longer in its recitation, as opposed to someone reading Qul Huwallahu Ahad or Wal Asr or the short surahs, and that can be done. It is permissible to do that. The prayer is not invalidated. However, to produce what is recommended, to be able to do what is recommended, there's a hajah, there's a need here, and the need will allow assistance. Right? So whatever is in the assistance of the prayer or the completion of the prayer can be a part of the prayer. Right? So sure, if you find yourself that you haven't memorized enough, or you're not going to be able to read enough to produce a healthy Fajr prayer, if you will, substantial Fajr prayer, then you can hold the Mus'haf, sure, no doubt. After that he says, anyone that possesses a Mus'haf, and the Mus'haf is, the Quran is the Quran. The Mus'haf is the actual, so we have a number of Masahif here. We have 50 or 60 Mushafs here. So if you possess a Mus'haf, then it's a must, or it's appropriate that you read from it every day, even if just a few ayat, so that you will not abandon it. Right, which is typical today, is that you have the Mus'haf and you put it on the shelf, and then sometimes we develop a collection of them. People give them in gifts, and then we have like 8 or 9 of them, or around the house, and we put it in the car. Right, so here he's saying that to have manners even with the Mus'haf is that you read from it, so as to not abandon the Mus'haf. It's also good for the person that recites the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to look at how caring and merciful Allah is with His creation, because He has connected them to the meanings of His speech by way of their understanding. This is from the mercy and kindness of Allah that He has delivered a book, He's delivered His speech, and He's allowed us to understand it. Right, so that's something that should be understood in and of itself. And also to know that what he's reading is not the speech of mankind. You're not reading it's not like reading a magazine or emails or text messages or Facebook posts, but what you're reading is the speech of the Divine, the Almighty. And of course, present in your heart is the magnificence of the one who is speaking. And so you should reflect over what he says, because reflection and pondering is the intent of reciting and reading. And if you're not able to reflect upon an ayah or a verse without repeating it, then you should repeat it. It was reported that Abu Dharr radiallahu anhu, of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, he stood in the night repeating one verse over and over again. It says, إِن تُعَذِّبْهُمْ فَإِنَّهُمْ عِبَادُكَ. If you were to punish them, then certainly they are your slaves. If you were to punish them, then certainly they are your slaves. And so the Prophet ﷺ repeated this verse over and over in Surah Al-Ma'idah, verse number 118. Tamim al-Dari radiyallahu anhu also repeated a verse. أم حسب الذين اجترحوا السيئات أن تجعلهم كالذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات. Do you think that those who commit evil actions will be made as those who do righteous good deeds? Are they the same? And so he repeated this verse. And others have repeated verses as well in an attempt to understand and to reflect. Also, the reciter of the Quran should seek clarification regarding every verse. I should say they should seek a clarification which is sufficient for them in order that they can understand. And they should read things in such a manner, read them clearly and seek clarity in order that they can understand what it is that they're reading. And if they were to recite, for example, خَلَقَ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ, that He created the heavens and the earth, He created the heavens and the earth, that you're able to reflect over such a verse to the point that you know and you can see the magnificence and the might of Allah in everything. When you look at everything, you're able to identify the strength and the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Another one, he says, أَفَرَأَيْتُم مَا تُمْنُونَ. He says, do you not see what you emit? And he's talking about sexual discharge. He should look at the nutfa, which we know is the drop, mutashabih, which is, it's kind of all the same, right? It's not like little babies or anything. It's just like a fluid. It's a fluid that comes out of you. And then how it develops. And it grows muscle tissue and bone and veins and nerves and develops into different forms where it has a head and hands and feet. And then it comes the various noble qualities like hearing and sight and intelligence and other things. So when you think about this is amazing. It's astonishing. Right? And so when you read, for example, خَلَقَ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ, that Allah created the heavens and the earth, and when you read things like أَفَرَأَيْتُم مَا تُمْنُونَ, look at what you emit. You're emitting a discharge, and then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grows it and develops it into the point that it becomes, as we know today, a human being. And this is something that would help us understand the power, the might, the magnificence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then when you were to recite or read about the conditions of the liars and deniers, then you should be overwhelmed with fear of the authority of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that fear comes from the possibility that you become heedless to His commands. You become heedless to His commands.